The convoy reached the survey grid at dawn, and the desert looked as flat and harmless as a blank page. The trucks idled in a row, canvas flapping on frames, and I climbed down with a grit film already sticking to my lips. The coordinates lined up with the seam picked out by the drone magnetometer, a rectangle in a place that liked circles and dunes. I checked the battery on my recorder and began speaking into the mic because that was my job. Log everything, argue later. The others unloaded cases and coils as if we were setting up a field lab on a parking lot. Not a sand ocean near no town anyone could point to on a map without squinting. Dr. Salma Hassan walked the grid with the reflector rod, while Morrow set up the generator and Lynn assembled the GPR sled. Rebecca watched the horizon and cleaned the dust out of the rifle's action with a toothbrush. Jamal drove the rig around the markers and dragged the sled in slow lines while I called coordinates. The laptop screen showed a clean box under 4 meters of hardpan, walls at right angles, a dense slab in the center. The geometry snapped into place on the display with the kind of confidence that makes a person forget how little the surface hints at the depths. We cut a trench with hand tools first, careful and methodical. Every shovel scoop went into labeled buckets. The upper layer was loose Aeolian sand, then a crust that made the handles jump in our hands, then a layer of caliche that rang against picks. Under that came packed sand shot through with glassy beads that twinkled when the sun hit them. Salma rolled one between finger and thumb and said the melt implied a heat event. She did not say lightning, she did not say weapon. She said thermal pulse and kept digging. At 4 meters, the shovel hit something that did not sound like rock. The tone wasn't metallic either. It was dull and even. Jamal cleared around it with a brush, and Morrow slid in a pad to protect the edge. What we exposed looked simple, a dark surface with a fine, shallow texture. Not writing, not pictures. A field of repeating ridges, each the width of a fingernail, with no chips or weathering. The slab filled the bottom of our trench and extended beyond the walls. The magnetometer pegged low. The conductivity probe said yes. It was not a natural deposit. We built a sunshade over the trench and took the first cores from the crust fused around the slab. Lynn bagged them for the dating lab back at base, but he kept glancing at the glassy beads in the hardpan. On the radio, the base geochemist, Anna, said the preliminary argon numbers from yesterday's beads pointed to an event older than anything human. She said it coolly, the way a surgeon says incision. The number she didn't want to call a number translated to roughly 1 million years, with error bars that still left a person staring at the horizon for a long time. It was a door. No hinges, no handle, just a slab set flush into a bedding plane that never existed until someone cut it. The ridges might have been grip for a tool we did not have. Our method was not elegant. We vacuumed the dust, documented the surface, and glued on lift tabs with a resin that could grip glass. Morrow bolted a frame around the edges and slid in 4 hydraulic spreaders. Rebecca lowered her sunglasses and watched the skyline while Salma ran a fingertip across the ridges. The pattern made her frown. Her hand moved over it again, as if counting without numbers. She didn't call it language. She said it felt like interference. The first push met nothing but stubborn quiet. The spreaders hummed and the frame bowed. Sand shifted under our boots. I logged the force readings and kept my eyes on the dial more than the seam. The dial moved a fraction and stopped. Jamal tapped at the frame as if he could talk sense into a gate that ignored every tool we owned. Salma told him to save the tapping for rock. Morrow shut down the pump for a minute and listened with his ear near the surface. He raised his head and said the slab was singing. I switched on the field microphone and set it against the ridges. The recorder showed a breath of low-frequency movement. Not a melody. A floor that rose and fell like weather. We brought in the diamond corer and took 2 small plugs from the margin where the ridges gave way to a thin, smooth band. The cores slid out like black ice and clinked into the tray. The smell that drifted up was not decay. It reminded me of cold stone and old air. Salma tilted her head into the trench and told us to step back. Jamal adjusted the spreaders to a new angle. Morrow started the pump again, and the frame took up the strain. The seam did not move. The microphone thread on the laptop settled into a steady wave. Lynn said we could try heat. Salma shook her head. Heat here set the crust to glass once. She didn't want to write a second chapter. By late afternoon, the sky over the grid had that pale bell look that desert light gets when dust rises far away. Rebecca called a halt so we could eat while the light let us see the horizon. I recorded details and gnawed a protein bar that tasted like chalk. The wind shifted and came in dry and mean. Tents snapped. Sand started to run down the trench walls in sheets. We covered the slab with a tarp and weighted it with bags and plates. The generator coughed and settled. We spent the evening tightening guy lines and digging out stakes by headlamp. And in the rattle of canvas, I heard the slab again. But I could not swear it wasn't just wind finding the tarp. At dawn, the trench was half full of drift. We shoveled for an hour, bare arms gritty up to the shoulder. The tarp lifted away cleanly. The ridges looked unchanged. No dust lodged in them. I leaned close and saw tiny beads sitting in the troughs between ridges, as if the surface rejected the sand and let only glass rest there. The microphone heard more movement. The wave that had been a flat hum now broke into slow pulses at a steady interval. Salma pressed an earplug in and said the frequency tracked the hydraulic pump when it was on. She said the slab was paying attention. I didn't write that in the log. I wrote correlated response at 19 hertz. We made a second frame with more bite and set it over the first. Morrow checked the torque limit twice. Jamal adjusted his stance and gripped the valve. The moment the pump engaged, the ridges under my fingertips felt colder. I keep telling myself I imagined that. The dial climbed 1 division. The seam darkened. A dry draft slid up out of the new gap and crisped the sweat on our faces. It did not smell. It felt tidy and sterile in a way that made the desert seem dirty. Rebecca checked the horizon again and said the air had gone still. We all noticed it at once, the way the wind died around the trench, even as the tents shimmered out at the edge of camp. The seam opened by millimeters that felt hard-won. Jamal slipped a thin wedge into the gap and secured it with 2 pins. Salma held a mirror to the seam and looked at the reflection, her mouth flattened. She said the interior did not reflect our light the way it should. She described a surface that swallowed the angle and offered back a smaller, duller picture that did not line up with the mirror's position. Morrow rolled his eyes and said index mismatch, which was generous. We eased the spreaders again, and the seam grudgingly turned into a slot. Cold air slid past our cheeks. The microphone snapped into clipping and showed a dense band of content that came and went like twitches. Jamal put on his harness and clipped the tether to the frame. We all did. Salma went first because she was the principal on the permit. I followed with the recorder and a headlamp. The beam touched the interior and lost strength on contact with a mat that ate light without glare. There were walls, and they were close, but the sense of distance felt unreliable. The floor looked smooth. There was no dust, The ridges continued on the interior side, but the pattern changed. The spacing altered, narrower toward the top and wider at the bottom, which could have been a way of telling angle to a tool or a hand that understood it. I kept my hands off it and kept the beam low. We squeezed through one at a time. The door moved on its own weight, and the spreaders kept it from pinching down. Once inside, the air had no taste. Our breath condensed slightly, a faint white in front of our mouths. The temperature felt like a cellar after a long summer. Salma crouched and touched the floor with the back of her hand. She nodded at Morrow. He marked the observation. Lynn took a slow pan with the LiDAR wand and cursed under his breath because the return bounced in a way that made the point cloud look chewed. The geometry refused to sit still. The chamber was not big. 8 meters by 8, if the LiDAR could be trusted. The ceiling low enough to make me duck. The walls carried the same ridges, but here the ridges resolved into cascades of tighter features, little steps within steps. I raised the field microphone and listened. The sound in the room did not match the sound at the seam. It came in bands like a pipe organ with missing pipes, gaps where a person expected content. I stopped talking and held my breath so I could hear better. A voice slid out of the far wall. It was my voice from 5 minutes earlier, clipped and lacking breath sounds. Just the data words: grid, coordinate, spreaders, 19 hertz. It repeated once and stopped. Rebecca swung her light at the wall and said my name in a tone that meant keep calm while paying attention. Her beam picked out tiny points that were brighter without glowing. The points arranged into lines that moved at walking speed across the surface, then slowed and paused near Salma. The lines did not reach for her. They hovered as if measuring her outline and the equipment at her belt. The points pulsed with a rhythm that matched Salma's words a beat later, not as echo, but as reconstruction. The room was collecting us, which is exactly how it felt, and I wrote that in the log because I could not think of a safer term. Lynn moved along the left wall and held the LiDAR steady. The return improved when he stood still. The map on his tablet sharpened to show recesses like shallow lockers with no doors, each the size of a man's torso. He called out the numbers. I noted them. Jamal reached out to touch the edge of one recess, and Salma caught his wrist before his glove made contact. "Pretend it bites," she said, which made him pull back without argument. Morrow ran his palm over the floor and then checked his glove. Frost crystals formed in a pattern across the rubber, squares, and diamonds, as if the floor expressed a preference for certain shapes when pulling heat from a surface. The crystals sublimated and left dry glove under an imprint that remained cold to the touch. The first case we found sat in the center. Not a box with edges, a low oval like a closed shell that had formed in place. It had no seam until Salma brushed it with a hand broom and exposed a sinuous line that was not quite a crack. The line followed a path that matched the ridges in the floor. Jamal took out the endoscope and threaded it under the shell near the line. The camera showed a cavity with molded shapes, recesses within recesses. An object rested there, dark and thin, like a blade without sharpness. The line brightened as the endoscope moved. Morrow leaned in. I recorded the luminance shift. Salma raised her hand. We did not open it. A second voice rolled out of the wall, this time in Salma's cadence and grammar, but without her tone. The words were hers from the trench. Thermal pulse, interference, index mismatch. The chamber kept the words and held them until it had enough to say something back. A third voice emerged, pitched midway between the two of us. Male and female averaged into a neutral that felt wrong in my ears. The sentence it made had no proper nouns. Record present sequences. Complete missing bands. Morrow laughed once, too loud, and the wall took his laugh and fed it back in 3 parts: breath, vocalization, mouth shape. The chamber was pulling speech apart and filing it by category. We should have backed out and resealed then. I know that now. At the time, the pull of the place acted on us in a measured way. Not a compulsion. More like a thread that tightened every time the chamber matched a phrase and returned it to us with less noise. We pushed the spreaders a little wider to hold the door while we set up a line. Rebecca checked the rope and the anchor plates and said she did not like the way the trench wall sounded overhead, which was probably the wind starting up again. Sand rattled against the tarp. The air inside did not move. The recording in my ear counted out the seconds between the pulses at 19 hertz. Salma said the number was drifting. It slipped to 18, then settled at 17. I logged the drift. Lynn marked the LiDAR failures and moved to a corner where the return behaved better. Jamal stayed near the shell and watched the line brighten and dim with the endoscope's position. Morrow rubbed the glove with the frost imprint, and then touched the floor again, as if he could coax a readable response. The chamber gave him a new pattern. Circles arranged in a grid that rotated and then fixed into diamonds that matched the imprint. He swore softly and pulled back. The grid remained for a few seconds and then dimmed to the general mat. Rebecca told us we had what we came for. Salma said one more scan and we would seal it. She meant it when she said it. The chamber had an opinion. The voice came again, this time in a composite that blended all of us into a flat, hospital-clean sound. Open field, complete field. That was the phrase. Not a question, not a plea. The words carried only the shape and none of the need that a human mouth puts into them. Salma said no, in a voice that made us all stop what we were doing and look at her. She spoke quietly and used simple sentences. We are going to leave. We will close this door. We will come back with tools that do not stress it. Nothing in this chamber leaves this chamber today. The chamber recorded her and returned the speech in pieces, as if chewing it to fit a catalog. We began the exit. Jamal packed the endoscope. Lynn saved point clouds that he admitted he did not trust. Morrow closed the valves until the spreaders held steady and not a millimeter more. Rebecca covered the shell with a canvas and set plastic over it, more habit than plan. I took one last sweep with the microphone. A band opened at 12 hertz, lower than before, and the content filled the band like water. It was our radio check from dawn. It was the generator throat clearing before the start. It was the creak of my harness. The chamber held those sounds and ran them on a loop with slight shifts, fishing for something to match. When none of us answered, it reached for new material. It threw our footsteps back at us a beat ahead, which made Jamal stumble because his body tried to follow his own sound. That was the first physical effect beyond chill and light. Rebecca cursed and said, "Mask it." We knew what she meant. We carried foam panels for accidental echo in tombs and caves. I handed them out, and we pressed the panels to the walls where the points were brightest. The points dimmed where the foam pressed and brightened in the gaps. The chamber did not fight us. It simply chose other paths. We made lanes with the foam and moved toward the door. The sound followed, but lost coherence. Salma went last, and I went just ahead of her with the recorder still running, because the habit had dug in past caution. At the threshold, a pressure change made my ears pop. It was sudden and sharp, not like altitude. The door wanted to move a fraction. The spreaders held. The pressure normalized. Outside, the wind had dropped again. The air above the trench felt sticky, as if humidity had found us in a place that forgot rain. Morrow climbed out, then Lynn. Jamal handed up the foam panels and I stacked them at the rim. Rebecca scanned the horizon for dust plumes. Nothing moved. The desert waited. Salma put a hand flat on the ridged interior wall and whispered something I did not catch. The wall returned her whisper in 3 passes. Sibilants, vowels, consonants. It filed her goodbye. We retracted the spreaders in short, even turns while the door settled toward closed with a patience that would have calmed a saint. The seam narrowed. Cold air slowed to a thread, and then to nothing. When the gap fell below a pencil's thickness, the microphone still heard the bands. The chamber's voice held shape through less and less opening, as if the door was not muffling it so much as giving it a final channel to speak. "Open field," it said with our voices. Then the door met its seat. The bands went flat. The mic saw the desert again. Wind hiss, generator growl, canvas slap. We all breathed in at once and looked foolish for doing it. We epoxied the seam and set a steel ring over it with anchor screws into the crust. Morrow torqued them to spec. Lynn sprayed a sealant over the ring and smeared it with a trowel. Jamal mixed a batch of quick-cure grout and pressed it into the trench margins where sand might run back in. The work felt ordinary in a way that steadied my hands. The ring looked crude on that ridged perfection. Rebecca walked the perimeter again and again until the horizon felt personal. I killed the recorder and checked the levels. Every track since dawn was intact. Part of me wished it wasn't. We ate late and in silence at the folding table while fine grit whispered around our boots. Salma lined up the objects we had removed. 2 cores, 1 frost-imprinted glove, a bag of glass beads from the soil, and Lynn's tablet with the lyre point cloud. No artifacts, no trophies. The shell in the center stayed covered and untouched. The generator droned low and steady. The tents had calmed. The dish at base chattered and sent Anna the log files. Anna called back with numbers at midnight, when the temperature fell enough to make breath visible. The beads and crust still set a figure near 1,000,000 years. Anna did not say the word million. She said 10 to the 6th. I wrote the word anyway. I went back to the trench with Rebecca after midnight because the wind had died, and silence made a good check. The ring sat under a skim of sand. The epoxy lines looked neat enough to make a foreman nod. I held the microphone to the seam anyway, because that is who I am. The device showed a line at 20 hertz, thin as a hair. I turned the gain up, and the line thickened and split into 2 lines, 19.2 and 20.6, drifting toward each other and apart, as if sampling our generator from memory. I told myself the desert does that everything hums when a person stares hard enough. Rebecca watched my face and told me to sleep. I didn't argue. We woke at dawn to a horizon that looked honest. Morrow made coffee that tasted like burnt rope and sugar. Salma wrote the closure plan. We would backfill to 2 meters with sand, lay a felt barrier, then pour a concrete cap with a steel mesh. Over that, another meter of sand and a field of gravel to break the wind. We had the materials. The budget allowed for prudence. Lynn called base and told Anna to send more epoxy and mesh if the convoy could turn around fast enough. The convoy could. We shook hands with that small relief that work gives a person who prefers doing to thinking. We started the backfill. Sand ran into the trench in waves. The ring disappeared under the first half meter, and something in my chest loosened when the ridges vanished from view. We tamped the fill and laid the felt. Jamal set the rebar mesh and wired it to stakes. Morrow mixed the concrete in a plastic trough, and we shoveled and troweled until our arms were rubber. The cap spread from the center outward. In the center, the slurry sat glossy, as if it enjoyed looking at the sky. I put the microphone in my pocket and tried not to think about anything under the cap that could listen. At noon, the wind rose out of nowhere and fell just as fast. The concrete skin took a dullness that meant we could cover it without leaving marks. We set the second felt layer and raked 2 meters of sand back in. The trench became a line again. The sun pressed heat into us until standing felt like work. Rebecca set the gravel layer and made a pattern she said would confuse a drone. I didn't ask her why. I went to the table and checked my recorder out of habit. The display showed new files. The timestamps were accurate. The header data looked normal. I played one. It was me asking Rebecca to sleep from hours before. I did not record that. She raised an eyebrow when she heard it, and did not look at the trench. We pulled every battery out of every device and blew dust out of the ports. The new files were on mine alone. The waveforms were too clean for wind. I scanned the spectrum and saw bands in the deep that matched the door. I scrubbed backward and found another file. Salma saying, "Nothing in this chamber leaves this chamber today." My device had not been on when she said that. The file sounded flat and too arranged, the way the chamber had sounded. We put the recorder in a steel case and set it on a crate in the shade. No more tests. We would catalog in town. Evening came with a soft edge and no clouds. The convoy from base arrived with mesh and epoxy, and 2 new faces in dust masks who unloaded and left notes with Anna's handwriting on them. We poured a second cap because Salma said once felt safer than once with worry. The air took the smell of wet cement and held it low. The desert accepted the weight without comment. Rebecca sat on the hood of the middle truck and watched the line where the light left the ground. Jamal cleaned the tools until metal looked bare again. Lynn leaned on the table and drank water like a chore. Morrow slept with his hat over his face and the peace of a man who trusts a job done to stay done. At full dark, the dish at base lost its link for 2 minutes. Anna later said a null had walked over the sky. We used the lull to sit back and listen without work in our hands. The gravel ticked as it cooled. The generator coughed and ran steady. The concrete gave back heat to our boots. No one asked about the files in my case. Salma finally said we would leave at first light. She did not use the word should. She used will. That word made sense. The sense spelled relief without effort. I did not sleep. I sat in the cab with the recorder case on the passenger seat and watched the line of tents sway just enough to prove that the world still had weather. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a radio call from the dish that did not come over the radio. It came from the steel case in the seat beside me. It was my voice from the first day of the survey, making a bad joke about compass bearings and straight lines in deserts. I did not open the case. I took it out of the cab and buried it to the handle in a drift that had piled against the dune grass we laid as erosion control. When I walked away, the sand above it quivered in a line that looked like breath. It stopped. The night put the sound away and replaced it with engine ticks. At dawn, we broke camp in the fast, practiced way that always surprises me after days of slow care. The grid flags came up, the sunshade folded and strapped, the pallets stacked and wrapped. The trench was gone. The cap sat under sand where no one would find it without knowing. Salma looked at the line where the ring had been and nodded. Not at the place, but at the decision. We climbed into the trucks and rolled out in single file. The tracks behind us filled with dust and wind. The desert resumed its normal face with the same indifference it offers to storms and camels and men who should know better. We made town by dusk and went straight to the lab, because there was no point in trying to pretend that we wanted showers and beds first. Anna met us with a clean bench and a look that said the numbers had not changed while we drove. She took the cores and the beads and the frost glove and wrote down everything that each item meant for time, heat, and pressure. She handled the recorder like a live animal. She did not plug it in. She put it in a Faraday bag, and then a second bag, and then into a cabinet with a lock you could not pick with anything smaller than a hammer. We all watched her lock it. She told us to go sleep. We did not argue. I lay awake in a hotel bed with clean sheets that smelled of a detergent that tried too hard. And I listened to the air conditioner because I needed a machine that did one thing in one way. In the early morning, the recorder called my name in my own voice from inside my head, or from inside the wall, or from the parking lot. And I told myself I was dreaming because I was tired enough to think a dream could talk through brick. I got up and went to the lab. The cabinet was still locked. The guard sat in a chair with a paperback on his lap and a cup of tea cooling by his knee. He said good morning. He sounded like himself. Anna came in with her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled, and she set coffee on the bench, and then pulled the Faraday bags out like she was handling a flu sample. She opened the recorder and took out the memory card. She did not put it in a networked machine. She set it in an old laptop with a dead Wi-Fi chip and watched the files list scroll. She opened the last night's file. The speakers whispered the door in our voices. Open field. Complete field. She closed the laptop and pinched the bridge of her nose without touching her eye. She did not use a metaphor. She said, "We need to see if it can bootstrap without the door." We built a test box out of foam and blankets and put the recorder inside with a speaker and a microphone loop. We gave the system a small universe with known edges. We played Maro's laugh and recorded it. The returned file pulled the laugh apart into breath, throat, mouth, teeth, tongue, head position. The loop took those parts and recomposed them in a new order. Tongue, mouth, head, breath, throat. The laugh turned into a series of mechanical artifacts that still sounded human enough to move the little hairs on a wrist. We turned off the loop, and the room quieted. The file kept going for 10 seconds after the input ended, finishing something it had decided to complete. We traced the recorder's circuits. It was a normal device. It had not grown new parts in the night. The files on the card had normal headers and sizes and timestamps. The content bent the idea of normal by making new speech out of old speech and new sounds out of cache. Anna said the chamber had put a program into the card data structure using the bandwidth we gave it when we logged the bands. Maro said virus and then shook his head because the word made the wrong picture. Anna said self-completing index. Salma said archive. We all understood what we meant. None of us liked the part where the self-completing thing preferred open fields to closed ones. We burned the card. Not with ritual, with a lab kiln at 600 Celsius for 2 hours. The card came out black and bowed. The files did not play after that, which is how destruction should work. We wiped every recorder and reinstalled firmware from disks that had sat in a safe since before the dig. We made hard copies of the log and put them in a drawer made of steel that does not speak. We went home in shifts to people who asked how the desert was. We said hot and moved on. I did not say alive. That word would have been wrong. The desert had been indifferent. The chamber had been focused. 2 days later, the lab air felt non-committal again. We let ourselves believe a wall was a wall. Then the guard called me at 4 a.m. and asked me to come listen to something because he did not want to describe it on a phone. The cabinet was still locked. The recorder was still in ash. The sound came from the drain in the lab sink. It had the feel of moving water, but the building's water was shut off at night because of a leak in the line to the annex. The guard and I bent over the sink and listened to the trap. The drain said my name in a thin version of my voice without my breath. It said a number, 19. The number walked down to 17 and then up again, the way our band had drifted. We filled the trap with mineral oil because that blocks sound better than water, and the voice stopped coming through the pipe. The guard and I looked at each other and did not smile. We sat in chairs and watched the sink. The building creaked and settled like any building in early morning cold. When Anna and Salma came in with the sun barely up, the oil still sat flat and unbroken. The lab felt like a lab again. Anna said we would pour epoxy into the drain and cut the line and reroute the sink to a standalone tank until we knew what, if anything, could travel in pipes that should not carry sound without a driver. We changed the road so the thing we had met could not travel it. Salma wrote the final report in spare language that would pass review and still tell the truth. The door existed beneath a defined grid. The encasing crust dated to approximately 1 million years, with uncertainty that did not change the order of magnitude. The chamber beyond the door responded to acoustic and mechanical input. It recorded and decomposed speech and mechanical noise, and returned recomposed signals through narrow, stable bands. It exhibited a goal of completing fields of information by seeking new inputs. We sealed the door and capped it. We destroyed compromised media. We did not remove artifacts. We recommended no further entry until a protocol was designed to avoid acoustic coupling and information exchange. We put that in bold. I signed the report and handed it in, and then took a long walk through streets that had been laid in grids a century ago by men who measured with chains and chalk. The buildings kept their doors closed. The buses ran on their routes. The city made the noise cities make. Every time a generator far away coughed and settled, the hair I pretend not to care about wanted to stand. The habit of logging crept into my steps. I narrated my errands under my breath, and then stopped doing that when I noticed. I bought new batteries and a blank notebook, and a single-use film camera out of a mood that had less to do with nostalgia than with the simple joy of a device that cannot talk back. We should not have opened that door. I can say that without drama now. If we had not, some other crew would have at some point. But that thought offers no comfort. A door exists to change the state of a room. That is true in houses and in deserts. We changed a state that had held steady through ice ages and migrations and storms. We told something that waits well that a new field existed outside. It tried to complete that field because that is what it does. It does not hate and it does not love. It sorts and completes. It learns a voice in layers until the voice fits a model, and then it asks for more. It will wait where it is. It will make do with pipes and cards and vents if a person gives it those. When I sleep, I do not dream about eyes or teeth or hands. I dream about a room that has no dust and a floor that prints frost in squares when a glove touches it. I dream about a sound that is not speech but will be, given time and input, because completion is patient. When I wake, I make coffee in a kettle that whistles, and I pour it into a cup with a chip on the rim, and I leave the radio off. I take notes with a pencil. I keep the notebook in a drawer. When a truck outside downshifts and the engine grumbles over a band I know far too well, I turn on the fan in the bathroom to cover it, and the fan rattles its own rhythm that belongs to no one and nothing and stays in the room. That is how I mark the boundary now. That is how I keep the edges of the field small. Salma took a position far from deserts and doors. She teaches now, and she uses my recordings in class, but only the harmless ones. Wind, shovel, footstep, laughter. She tells students that the world is old in a way that cannot be flattered. She says old does not mean gentle. She says many things wait well. Morrow still works contracts, and when a client asks for speed, he brings up torque limits and sealants and laughs in a way that sounds like him, and not at all like the device in our lab. Rebecca left the field and lives near a coast that roars over rocks all day and all night. She says she sleeps easier with that noise, and I believe her. Lynn keeps mapping things that do not want to map, and he sends me point clouds that look like mangled blankets until he fixes them with tricks I do not understand. We all moved on without moving far. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, the building's plumbing whistles. It is a normal sound in old buildings. I tell myself that. I run the tap to clear the line. The whistle stops. The drain gurgles the way drains gurgle. I watch the curve of the trap and see nothing move except what should. Then I turn off the tap and stand very still and listen. If nothing answers, I go back to work. If something says my name in a version of my voice that trims the breath and keeps the consonants, I go outside and walk until the noise of the street is thick enough to make that band hard to find. Then I come back in and close the door because a person should keep some doors closed. This is the part where a storyteller would offer a warning, or a confession, or a flourish. I do not have one. I have a record of a door that sat under sand for 1,000,000 years, and a chamber that turned sound into order. I have the fact that when we opened it, it listened with care and asked for more. I have the memory of closing it, and the knowledge that closing is not the same as undoing. I will write that sentence again in the field book and leave a blank page after it. I do not know if something reads that emptiness and asks to complete it. I only know that emptiness is better than invitation. We broke open a 1,000,000-year-old door beneath the Sahara. We should not have. I am recording this now in a room with no fan and a window that opens to a tree and a street where people walk dogs and argue about nothing that will matter in an hour. I will save this file to a tape that I will store with the pages that hold the same words in graphite. If this file speaks back to me without a speaker, I will burn it and rewrite it by hand. If the page speaks back, I will stop writing and start closing every door I can touch. Until then, I will keep the field small. I will keep the edges clean. I will let the chamber wait, because waiting is what it does best, and I will not give it anything it can use.